Hello friends, welcome back to your UPSC. Today we are going to start with a new concept of human geography, that is behavioral approach and radical approach. So let's get started. So first we will study about radical approach. Radical approach, or we can say the concept of radicalism, it is a very new concept, just 25 to 30 years old. Okay. So, this approach is a value based approach that was developed in 1970s as a reaction to quantitative revolution and positivism. So, this radical approach it was developed against the quantitative approach and positivism. That means on and all it was against capitalism. Okay. So, radicalism was on the point of view that the quantitative approach and positivism they tried to make geography a spatial science. Okay. So they tried to make geography a spatial science, and they totally neglected the concept of, or they totally neglected human. So human and environment and their interrelationship, they were totally neglected in radical approach. Sorry, in quantitative approach and positivism. Now, if we look at the history of radicalism, we will see that this radical approach it originated in USA. Okay, USA being a capitalist country, but even though here the radicalist approach it originated in late 1960s. Okay. Now, this radical approach or the radical geography movement, it came or it originated because of some of the contemporary issues that were going on at that time. First one was the Vietnamese War, second one was the civil right, and the third one was inequalities. Okay, so in the Vietnamese War, during this war, we can see that in the Western world, like in USA, in Paris, in London, we will see that there was a great social unrest that was going on as a protest against the Vietnamese War. Okay, so then we had civil rights. In civil rights, we will see that in USA, blacks were not given equal position, equal facilities, equal status as the whites. Okay, so this social discrimination this lead to the rising of radicalism. Then we can see that in the urban ghettos and in rural areas, some of the deprived rural areas, we will see that people there they suffered with great inequalities. Okay, so because of that there was great social unrest and tension in the area. So these causes they lead to the origin of radical geography. Now, according to the radicalist, all these inequalities, all these sufferings, all these wars, they were caused by the capitalist mode of production. Okay, so the radical scholars or the radicalist they criticize the contemporary liberal capitalist society. Okay, so they were criticizing the capitalist society, and they started as a criticism or as a critique of capitalist society, but later on they followed the path of Marxism, and they became, or this whole approach it became a communist approach or a Marxist approach. Okay, now this radicalist approach, if we see, it was mainly concentrated on the issues of great social relevances like we have inequalities, we have racism, sexism, crime, and discrimination amongst the people on the basis of their color, their age, their sex, or on the basis of their economy. So, this radical approach, it was mainly concentrating on these topics or on these issues. Because of this radical approach or radicalism, it criticized the political hollowness, because the if we look at the quantitative revolution or positivism, we will see that these approaches, they mainly concentrated on profit maximization. Okay, but these topics of social relevance were not considered by them. So, according to the radicalist, this whole problem can be solved only by replacing the central bureaucracy, which was the which was influenced by capitalism. Okay, so radicalism basically focused on replacing the central bureaucracy by an anarchist model. Okay, so it actually said that the problem of poverty or the social discrimination, it cannot be solved by redirection of income, or only by simply directing the income or distributing the income or money in the amongst the poor. This problem cannot be solved. So for solving this problem, the whole system, the whole administrative system has to be changed. So So we can see that many geographers, they work towards this direction. The main contribution or main credit can be given to the scholars like Pete, William Baines, who gave or who published the articles which were having more of social relevance in the geographical topic than the concept of profit maximization. Okay, so we have scholars like, okay, so these scholars, they published various journals. Like for example, we have William Baines, who published Antipode in 1969. So this was a radicalist journal which was founded in Clark University, and this journal, this Antipode, it dealt with the problems like urban poverty, discrimination against women, colored people, and minority group. So all these social crimes, these social amenities, these were covered in these journals. And we can see that many articles were published that time which were supporting the third world countries. Okay, so on and all, we can say that the radicalists, they took the side of oppressed and they advocated their causes, and they also tried to bring some social changes so that the oppression or the oppressed classes can be relieved. Now, if we talk about the salient features and objectives of radicalism, we will see that it tried to expose the issues of inequalities, exploitation, deprivation, and discrimination, and all such sort of exploitations that were done by the capitalist countries. Okay. The next is it tried to highlight the weaknesses of positivism and quantitative revolution. So, as we have studied earlier, that it said that this positivism and quantitative revolution, they only focused on the money making aspect. Okay, but the most important aspect, that is human and the interrelation of human and environment, were neglected. So they tried to, or they had an objective to criticize positivism and quantitative revolution. Next is, they tried to remove or any sort of inequalities, whether it be regional inequality, economic inequality, or we can say gender inequality. So it tried to remove any sort of inequalities. And because it was mainly concentrating on men and its relation with environment, so it tried to improve the relationship between man and environment, as it was of the view that the person or the society should live in a greater harmony with their natural surrounding, and the society should be a self-sufficient unit. And with all this, his major aim or his goal was to develop a equal, just, free and tension-free society where everyone can live peacefully. Now, if we talk about the criticism, we will see that this radicalism, it tried to focus on passive role of human being, because of which human, it became the creator of history. Okay, because of excessive passivism, human became, or human was represented as a creator of history than being a product of history. Okay, next is, because of Marxist orthodoxy, or because they overly emphasized on this Marxist concept, so they stressed on time, on the concept of time, then space. Okay, so they totally, or they, we can say, they gave minimal stress or minimal focus to the concept of space, and they were more focused on the concept of, or the aspect of time. But in geography, the space is the most important element of study. Okay, so this is the basic criticism. Next, we can see that radicalism, because it was orthodox concept and it lacked flexibility, that is why it was not able to change with the change in time. Okay, so it was rigid, and because of lack in flexibility, it was not able to change with the change in time. And with the span of time, we can see that radicalism, it itself became, it itself degenerated the concept. Why? First one is the idea of Marxism, it was criticized. Okay, so we can see that the Marxist ideas in the later time, they were criticized by the people all over the world. Okay, so because the Marxist idea, it itself criticized, so the concept of radicalism, it gradually degenerated. Next is, we can see that USSR, which was representing the whole communist countries, it collapsed. Okay, so the communist countries, they collapsed, and because of the failure of communist countries, people tried, or people, they became skeptic against the idea of Marxism and communism. Okay, so the concept of radicalism was ignored. Then last one is, this concept of radicalism, it was generated in USA, which was a capitalist country, and this concept was not able to reach the communist world. So because it was not able to reach the communist world, it lacked any real time example. So this concept was not having any practical experience. So this was radicalism. Now our next approach is behavioral approach. Behavioral approach or behavioralism. As the name suggests, behavioral approach, it studies the behavior. Okay. So this approach, it studies the behavior, or we can say it examines the human behavior by using a disaggregate approach. Okay. So by using various technique, it tries to examine human behavior. As in the last lecture, we have studied that the quantitative approach, it does not give any special position or any importance to a individual or a human being. So this behavioral approach, it developed as a dissatisfaction of or dissatisfaction against the quantitative revolution and positivism, because they used statistical technique which were based on economic rationality. Okay. So the economic rationality, or we can say the statistical technique that were based on economic rationality, they are not possible in the real world, because the main aspect, that is human, his decision making process or his decision, they are influenced by various external factors. So on the basis of that, this behavioral approach, it was developed. So this behavioral approach, it developed as a dissatisfaction of representing man as economically rational. Okay. By the models and theories developed by positivism, as we can see, as we have studied, that all these quantitative revolution and positivism, they considered man to be rational, having the whole knowledge about its space. Okay. So this is not really acceptable. Okay, because this concept or this assumption is not practical. So after quantitative revolution, after some times, the geographers, they began to realize that the models that were propounded and the tests that were done, they were not giving exact result, because they were poorly describing, or they were giving poor description of the geographical realities and the man and environment relation. Okay. So we can say that the prediction power or the assumptions of the quantitative revolution about the geographical theories, they were slow as well as they were weak. So the predictions, they were weak. So as we can see that in the central place theory, for example, in the central place theory, this we will study in economic geography. So in this central place theory, this theory is based on the statistical and mathematical techniques. Okay. We can see that the assumptions that were made by using this mathematical techniques, they explained the spatial organization of the society, but this spatial organization of the society, it was found inadequate. As we can see that this whole theory, it was based on mathematical calculations and statistical data. It lacked the concept of behavior. Okay. So the humanistic behavior was not explained, and this humanistic behavior, it changed the whole result of the theory. Okay. When it was brought to practical, or when this theory was brought in practical, the humanistic behavior was influencing the most, which was absent in the theory. Okay, so because of the absence of humanistic behavior in this theory, the end result of the concept or the end result of the theory, they were not at all matching with the theoretical results. So by giving these examples, the geographers or the behavioralistic geographer, they concluded that man is not a economically rational being which focuses on just profit maximization, but there are various factors which influences his decision making, and one of the most prominent factor is behavior. Okay, so with this, the concept of behavioral geography or behavioralism, it came into being. Now if we look at the objectives of behavioral approach, we will see first objective is obviously it tried to replace the quantitative techniques and the statistical methods with the humanity. Okay, so in place of the quantitative technique and mathematical formulas, it tried to replace them with humanity. So the main focus of this theory was on man and his behavior. Now next objective was it tried to define the cognitive environment which determines the decision making process of a man. So this theory, it actually tried to explain the influence of environment or the surrounding in which the man lives. Okay, so this, how this environment or how this surrounding, they influence the decision making process of a human being, that was tried or that the geographers or the behavioral geographers were trying to explain. Next is it tried to unfold the spatial dimension of psychological and social theories of human behavior or human decision making and human behavior. Okay, so the philosophical concept, we can see that the philosophical concept, they were brought in this behavioral geography. Okay, so this behavioral geography, it includes the concept of philosophy, or it includes the philosophical aspect because it talks about the behavior of human being. So a spatial dimension of philosophy was opened, or it tried to unfold the spatial dimension of philosophy, so that this approach, this philosophical approach can be or can be fitted in the geography. Next is it, it tried to move the focus from aggregate population or from the society to an individual. So the focus of behavioral geography was not on the whole society but was on an individual. Okay, next is it tried to find the alternative of mathematical and statistical methods. Okay, so that was, as we have studied in the first objective, that it tried to replace the mathematical and statistical method. So other methods, it tried to generate other methods so that this mathematical and statistical methods for generating models, for generating laws can be replaced. Next is it tried to emphasize on the processual rather than the structural explanation of human activity. So rather than on the structural explanation or on the what face, sorry, rather than on the end result, it tried to focus on whole process which uh, or it tried to emphasize on the whole process. Okay, rather than on the end result, it tried to emphasize or it tried to study the whole process, so that the environment can also be studied, or the influence of environment can also be studied along with the human behavior. Next is, instead of the already collected data, or instead of published data, it tried to generate, or it emphasized on generating the primary data about the human behavior. Okay, so rather than one person collecting the information about the person or the human or the humanistic behavior, then publishing it into a book, then the geographers reading that data, the geographers, they tried to directly collect the data from the individual. Okay, so they tried to generate primary data rather than secondary or tertiary data. Lastly, we can see it adopted an interdisciplinary approach for the theory building and problem solving. So rather than being just in one discipline or in one arena, it tried to spread its focus, or spread this approach in all the discipline. Okay, so it became an interdisciplinary approach so that the theories can be built and the problems can be solved. Now, if you look at the basic aim of behavioral geography, we can see that it basically tries, or it basically aims that people have an environmental image. Okay, so if the people have that environmental image, they can identify, or this image can be identified accurately by the researchers. Okay, so like this is a plane, or this is the environmental image. So a researcher will accurately try to identify the image, and with that image, and with the actual image, and the image which a person or an individual or the experimental individual will see. So the researchers will try to build a strong relationship between the environmental image and the actual behavior on the decision making process of man. Okay, so it basically tries to focus, or it basically tries to analyze the influence of environment on the decision making process of men. Okay, now if we talk about the characteristics of behavioral geography, we will see that this behavioral geography, it adopted psychologists and philosophers to analyze the man and environment relationship. Okay, so as we have seen earlier in the aims, so the researchers, they were psychologists and philosophers who can give a accurate image, or give the accurate description of the image, and with that actual image and the behavior of human, the analysis of man and environment relationship can be done. Okay, so the philosophers, or the psychologists and the philosophers, they were adopted by this behavioral geography so that man and environment relation can be analyzed. Next is, it is an inductive approach which aims at building general statement out of observation of ongoing processes. Okay, so on and all, by analyzing the whole process, this behavioral approach, it tries to give, or it aims to develop, or it aims to build at bringing or building a general statement, okay, from all the observations of the processes that it makes. Okay, lastly, this behavioral approach, it tries to understand the behavior of man on the basis of its environment. So it tries to understand how the behavior of man changes with the change in environment, how the environment influences the humanistic behavior. Now, if we talk about the salient features of behavior geography, we will see that behavioral geography, it argues that the environmental cognition or the environmental perspective upon which the people act, like how the people behave in a certain environment, it may differ. It may differ from the true nature of the real environment. Okay, so the environment, if the environment is X, okay, this is the environment. So there are different perspective of looking at the environment. For example, if we take a glass which is having half filled water, so some people will consider this glass as half filled, while some people, they will consider this glass as half empty. Okay, so there are different perspective, or there are different cognitions of making an image about the environment. Okay, so this cognition or this perspective, it may totally differ from the actual actual nature of the real environment. Okay, so we can say that this environment has a dual characteristic. Okay, so this dual characteristic is, first is an objective environment. We have two environment. First is the objective environment, which is the actual world. Okay, while the another one is behavioral environment, which a person, or we can say the world in the mind. Okay, so this is the imaginary world, or whatever we imagine about the, or whatever image that we take about that environment. Okay, so these are the two environment, or these are the, this is the dual characteristic of the environment. And this dual characteristics, it changes with the change in knowledge of a human being. Okay, so more the knowledgeable the person is, the image of the imaginary world or the behavioral image will be close to the objective environment, or the behavioral environment will be close to the objective environment. Now this decision making process, it is influenced by the environment. Hence the decision making process also change with the knowledge of the person. Okay, the next salient feature is that it gives weightage to individual rather than a group or society. This we have already discussed, that the focus of study in behavioral approach is an individual rather than the whole group. Okay, because this behavioral study or this behavioral approach, it tries to study the behavior of an individual in a certain environment. Next is, it postulates mutual interaction or relationship between man and environment. Okay, so the mutual interactions, or we can say that the relationship between man and environment, in which the man, it shaped the environment, and it was ultimately, or we can say it was eventually shaped by the environment. Okay, so there is a mutual interaction or mutual interrelationship between the man and environment. So this relationship is postulated by behavioral geography, where a man is influencing the environment. Okay, and it is also influenced by the environment. Man is also influenced by environment, as well as it is also influencing the environment. Okay, lastly, the last salient feature is, it is having a multidisciplinary outlook. Okay, Now, behavioral geography, it takes help of various ideas, various theories from philosophy, from psychology, from history, from sociology. So, there are many disciplines that are included or that are involved in the behavioral study. So, it has a multidisciplinary outlook. So, this is the diagram of the exact functioning of environment and men, how they both influences each other. So person will have an environmental image. So I'm a person, I'm having an image of the environment. Okay, so whatever image I'm having of that environment, it will influence my behavior. Okay, and because of my behavior, the image that I'm taking of that environment, it changes. Okay, so behavior, it influences the way of looking at an environment or the image we take about that environment, and the image that we take about that environment, it also influences the behavior of human being. So we can simply say that the image that we take, it is influenced by our behavior. Okay, so this behavior is influenced by our knowledge, while there is a real image of that environment. Okay, so this real image, or we will get closer to the real image, or our behavioral image will get closer to the real image with increase in our knowledge. Okay, so with the information, we will be more closer to the real image. Okay, now this information we can get on the basis of our studies, of our value system. So this whole value system, it influences the image that we take about that environment. So this is the whole concept of behavioral approach. Now we will talk about the demerits of behavioral approach. So the first demerit is it lacks synthesis of empirical finding because of poor communication, then duplication and conflicting terminologies. Okay, so it is having lack of synthesis of empirical finding, it is having lack of communication, it is having inadvertent duplication. Okay, so all these are the demerits of behavioral geography. Next is there is no clear definition of the terminologies. Okay, so the terminologies, they are not clear. Next is the concept, or the whole concept, it is not clear because they are poorly integrated. So there is no sync between one concept and another. Okay, so they are not interrelated and they are poorly integrated. So the whole concept, it remains unclear. Next demerit is all the data that are generated, they are generated by the laboratory experiment. Okay, so the laboratory experiment, they are done on the animals. Okay, so they actually test that in a certain environment how will an animal react. Okay, so on the basis of that reaction, they generate the data. But this data and this data which is generated by the experiment, it is directly implied to human behavior. But they are not considering the fact that there is a lot of difference between an animal and a human being. Okay? Human beings have different emotions. Its behavior, it changes according to its emotions, according to the environment. Okay? So these experimental datas, they are not exactly fitting with the human behavior. Then the next criticism of the behavioral approach is that it emphasizes too much on ego-centered interpretation of environment. Okay, so there are two assumptions in this criticism which are mainly criticized. Okay, first assumption is that the scholar says, the behavioral scholar, they say that they will have a clear image of the environment, but this assumption is not at all possible, because the image, or the image, like however clearly it may be taken, but it can be, or it will be distorted by the mental imagination. Okay, so the clear image, they will the researcher will never have the clear image of the environment. Next is, they say that there is a strong relationship between the behavioral world and the actual world. But for this assumption, there is no proof. Okay, so there is very less research done on the interrelationship, or there are very less experiments or researches done on finding the relationship between the behavioral image and the real image. Lastly, or second last, we can see that this behavioral geography, or this behavioralism, it considers man to be a human psychologist. But we can see that the human psychology, it differs from one individual to another on the basis of its environment, or on the basis of its belonging, on the basis of its knowledge. So the man is not homo psychologicus. Okay, lastly, because this approach is theoretical, so there is a wide gap between the theory and the practice of this approach. Okay, as we can see that the interpretations, they are made on the basis of observation. There is no participation in the experiments, so the assumptions that are made, they are theoretical, but in the practical, or in the real world, there is, or the result, they differ from the theoretical results. So these were the demerits of behavioral approach, and with this we come to the end of our lecture. So that was all for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's lecture. Let's meet in our next class. Till then, take care and have a nice day. Thank you.